If there was a rock god of the grunge era, it was Chris Cornell.
He was iconically grunge. He had the look of a grunge rock star who didn't really care what people thought of him, but yet it was pretty orchestrated what he did on stage.
He was great looking with an incredible 4-octave vocal range and songwriting talent for days. But Chris Cornell's entire career was kind of a slow motion, nervous breakdown. And it seemed that those demons began to return.
When Chris Cornell died, everyone wanted to know what happened.
He had this thing for strong women that would look after his interests.
There's bad blood between Soundgarden and Vicki.
Vicki knows that she is sitting on a lot of music and a lot of money. Because why? People want more Soundgarden, and they want more Chris Cornell.
It's inevitable. It's a recipe for a dispute.
This is about millions and millions and millions of dollars.
When a celebrity checks out, there's no shortage of people ready to cash in. There's a ton of money to be made on the backs of dead celebrities. And with millions of dollars at stake, the battles over the estates of the rich and famous can lead to some serious drama. This is the story of how Chris Cornell turned his inner darkness into millions, and the estate battle that ensued over 7 unreleased tracks that pit his widow against the remaining members of his band Soundgarden.
Have you found, music to be therapeutic for you?
I think for me, it was probably the first thing I found in my life that was.
When grunge rock icon Chris Cornell dies in the middle of a tour in May of 2017 from an apparent suicide, the world is caught completely off guard.
As far as anybody knew, that last tour was going great. There was no indication, none whatsoever, that anything was wrong.
Chris Cornell's death was especially shocking because we didn't know as much about his private life. We knew him through his music. We knew that his music could be dark.
Initially, some reports say Chris Cornell was worth as much as $60 million and counting. In fact, just a week after his untimely death, his music catalog surges by 552%. Though details of his estate are scarce, it's thought to include multi-million-dollar homes in Rome, Paris, and New York City, sports cars like a vintage 1955 Porsche Speedster Spyder worth an estimated $6 million, custom motorcycles including a $35,000 Harley-Davidson FXR, 13 music awards, numerous guitars, and his most prized possessions, 7 unreleased songs worth hundreds of thousands of dollars.
There is unreleased music, and it is worth a lot of money. And at this point, we don't know who will be able to profit off of all of it.
According to Chris's will, his sole beneficiaries are his widow Vicki, the mother of his youngest daughter and son, and the Cornell Family Trust. But soon after his untimely death, the first of many bitter estate battles would surface. While the biggest fight over money would be between Vicki and Chris's former bandmates from Soundgarden, the original feud to make headlines is over Cornell's first wife and former manager, Susan Silver, who goes to court demanding a cut of his estate.
When the untimely death of Chris happened, it brought back some of the issues that Susan didn't feel were ultimately fairly resolved in their divorce, and that included the fact their daughter Lily was not adequately financially taken care of for the future.
Vicki Karianis married the rocker in 2004 while Cornell was in the midst of an acrimonious property dispute with Silver, who he'd separated from in 2002 after 12 years of marriage.
Chris's fans accuse Vicki of breaking up his longtime marriage to Susan. Now, it was Susan who helped build up Chris's career, and his fans find this to be a complete betrayal.
After a brutal breakup in the late 90s from his iconic grunge band Soundgarden, Chris and his bandmates had reunited and were preparing for their latest album during what would be known as their fateful final tour. However, Chris's controversial death would put the highly lucrative project on hold.
At this point, I think fans would want a Soundgarden album, even if it's from beyond the grave.
2 years later, in 2019, an estate battle ignites and threatens to prevent the last 7 songs Chris Cornell ever wrote from ever seeing the light of day. And that's when Whitney Cornell sues Soundgarden for trying to strong-arm her into turning over the audio recordings by withholding royalties owed to his estate for his children.
It's very well known that there's bad blood between Soundgarden and Vicky.
Soundgarden lashes back in court.
Soundgarden claims that, wait a second, those demos are for us. We own them.
They file a countersuit accusing Whitney Cornell of misappropriating funds from a charity show they played in Chris's honor and hijacking the band's social media accounts.
You throw some mud at me, and I'm gonna throw some more back at you. This is typical for estate battles. Parties in court get down and dirty.
Vicky goes further to accuse Soundgarden guitarist Kim Thayil of endangering her family by using his social media accounts to insinuate that she was blocking the release of the album.
There are some rumors that Chris wanted to divorce her, but in doing so, she would fail to inherit $60 million from his estate. So the fans are saying that Vicky killed him or had the bodyguards kill him.
The 52-year-old rocker had grappled publicly with depression and addiction, but his friends, family, and fans were shocked to learn that his death would be ruled a suicide.
We tend to have a very kind of skewed perception of our heroes and our rock stars. We tend not to want to look too deep into what's really going on because we don't want to think about them not being here. And unfortunately, in Chris's case, his problems weren't the kind of problems that you grow out of.
Throughout his career, Chris mined his inner turmoil and turned it into musical gold. And it all began in the dark, moody, and rainy city of Seattle, which becomes the epicenter of grunge.
One of the most incredibly explosive and commercially successful genres of music in the history of rock.
One of 6 kids, Christopher John Boyle is born on July 20th, 1964 in Seattle, Washington. He takes his mother's last name when his parents divorce.
Chris Cornell grew up in a rough area of Seattle, and he was involved with a lot of kids that were doing sort of lots of petty criminal things and involved in drugs. Apparently, he had had a very bad experience with angel dust that triggered a depression in him, which turned out to be a lifelong struggle with mental illness.
When his mother bought him a snare drum, music became Chris Cornell's saving grace.
Mom was a bit of an eccentric. Let's just call her a wannabe mystic. She understood the need for art.
By the 1980s, Chris starts playing in cover bands, where he meets guitarist Kim Thayil, who becomes one of his closest musical collaborators. They form a band and call themselves Soundgarden. In the beginning, Chris does double duty as a drummer and singer, but his singular 4-octave voice quickly catapults him from behind the drum set to center stage.
He had this massive voice that could be very delicate in its delivery, but then he could belt it out like a jet engine. He had range. I mean, there had to be at least 4 octaves worth of range. When he screams and gets up to the top of the notes in some of those songs, that's something you can't teach. You gotta be born with that.
At first, Chris isn't completely comfortable being the frontman, but he quickly adapts and creates a powerful stage persona. His voice, sex appeal, and physical intensity on stage dominates the stadium.
Chris was not intending to be the front man of this band, but he graciously stepped into the role. And he actually had a bit of humor about it. It was said that he would go into thrift stores specifically to shop for shirts that he could rip off on stage.
Chris Cornell was a man who was born to be a rock star.
But it was more than his stage persona that connected Chris Cornell to the fans.
Chris Cornell's lyrics were darker, and I think they made it okay for us to not be so boppy and poppy and let's go to the dance club and just have fun. He spoke to what we were feeling on the inside and were afraid to say on the outside.
In their corner, helping to push them into the big leagues, is their manager, Susan Silver. She also happened to be Chris's girlfriend and later on his wife.
She is considered to be one of the great rock and roll managers of the 90s and the 2000s.
Let's face it, these guys would not have been able to make it on their own without a woman like Susan and her connections and what she knew about the industry.
Any worries about Chris Cornell's romantic relationship with the band's manager are disregarded when Susan Silver lands Soundgarden a contract with a major label. helping them sell more records and reach even more fans than ever before.
Susan is in love with the lead singer, so of course she has a vested interest in making this band as successful as it can be, and she is pouring blood, sweat, and tears to make that happen.
In September 1991, Soundgarden releases their breakthrough album, Bad Motorfinger. But music alone wouldn't be enough to propel them to the top of the charts.
MTV was absolutely crucial to the career of every pop, rock, and rap act of the time.
But when the video of their first single, Jesus Christ Pose, is banned by MTV for its incredibly graphic images, their climb towards fame and fortune looks like it will be over before it even begins.
Never stop rocking, gentlemen, never.
When rock superstar Chris Cornell, who rose to fame with the grunge band Soundgarden, dies in 2017 from a suicide, early reports estimate his estate is worth $60 million. But back in 1991, after years in the trenches, Chris and his band Soundgarden have been signed to a major label, A&M Records.
Bottom line is that Soundgarden needed to get on a major label so they could get better distribution, better promotion, and a better return on what they were doing.
Soundgarden is huge in Seattle, but they're far from a household name in the rest of the country when Bad Motorfinger is released. The first single, Jesus Christ Pose, is met with instant controversy.
First of all, let's just think about that title. Secondly, let's think about the imagery in that video with skulls and crucifixes and somebody on a cross and all the rest of it.
The imagery in the video outraged many people who perceived it as anti-Christian, and possibly more detrimental to their success. The video their label paid for is banned from MTV.
If there was no MTV, well, where else were you going to see these videos? YouTube was still years away from being invented, so to spend all this money creating a music video only not to have it shown on MTV, whoa. That was a problem.
But MTV's ban doesn't crash and burn Soundgarden's success. Instead, it fuels it.
Every band hopes for one of their songs or videos to be banned because it gets you the attention that you might not otherwise be able to get. This was absolutely the case with Soundgarden. Everybody was talking about them, Bad Motorfinger blew up, and the band became what they became.
Bad Motorfinger is among the 100 top-selling albums of the year, hitting platinum status.
A platinum album is an album that has sold 1 million copies. It is probably the single most important designation for any album sale.
Soundgarden is nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Metal Performance Music. Eventually, Bad Motorfinger will hit multi-platinum status. But in 1991, Chris Cornell's personal fortune is still on an upward trajectory, and he can't be called a millionaire just yet.
If you're in a band that sells 1 million copies of a record, are you a millionaire? It all depends on how much money the record company advanced you to make that record. It could be that you sell 1 million or 2 million copies, yet you're still paying off your advance. So it's hard to say exactly how much money the band was bringing home at that time. They were doing okay, but as for being able to, buy gold-plated toilets, they weren't in that league just yet.
Jesus Christ Pose remains banned by MTV to this day, but Soundgarden becomes part of MTV's heavy rotation, in large part due to Chris Cornell's star power.
Chris Cornell had a very unique and dramatic stage presence.
Chris Cornell was hot.
But the few times that I did meet Chris Cornell, the most interesting thing about him is something that I found about the most outlandish stage performers. As much as he could growl on stage and rip his shirt off and get crazy and get people really into it, off stage he was very quiet, very reserved, and very dignified.
Chris was also developing into a prolific songwriter who was channeling his pain, alienation, and emotions into his music.
He was the golden child of Seattle who wasn't perfect, who had problems, who shared his problems, who wrote about his problems, who made us feel better about our problems. It put Seattle on the map in a way that we wouldn't see until Starbucks.
1992 is a banner year for Chris Cornell. He's got 2 best-selling albums, and his videos are getting heavy rotation on MTV. Temple of the Dog is a deeply personal tribute album to a fallen friend.
On the Seattle scene in the early days of grunge, the band that everybody thought was going to be the biggest was not Nirvana, was not Soundgarden. It was a band called Mother Love Bone, and it was run by a guy called Andrew Wood.
Chris had been roommates with Andrew, and just before the band was about to release what they thought was going to be a big breakthrough record, he dies of a heroin overdose. And Chris is completely bereft about this. So he writes a bunch of songs under the name Temple of a Dog, has some friends come in and help him with this.
To honor his late friend, Chris gets to work on a side project with another group of friends who will go on to form another huge grunge group known as Pearl Jam.
They decided to turn a couple of tracks into a full album. That album became Temple of the Dog, and it was one of these side projects that is now become legendary.
When Temple of the Dog is initially released in April of 1991, it sells a respectable 70,000 records. But as grunge becomes the dominant force in rock music, the album explodes and goes platinum.
It really was a sign of things to come on that scene, the darkness and the tragedy that would go along with all the tremendous success.
But even with all the commercial success, in 1993, Chris Cornell can't help himself from rebelling when he changes up his famous look with a drastic haircut.
Chris Cornell had this love-hate thing with his hair. Terrific hair on the guy. But he became very disillusioned that all the press attention, when it came to him, seemed to focus on his looks. He wanted the band's music to speak for itself. Susan Silver, his wife, is off managing some other band, probably Alice in Chains at this time. Soundgarden's on a bit of a break, and he's feeling a little alone and a little daring. So he figures, you know what, I'm cutting off all this hair. And he did. And then he sent it to his wife in a bag saying, see what I've done? Now, that probably was one of the most traumatizing haircuts since Robert Smith of The Cure cut off his hair in the early 1980s, and fans freaked out.
By March of 1994, Soundgarden is back releasing their highly anticipated fourth album. Super Unknown debuts at #1 on the Billboard 200 album chart, selling 310,000 copies in its first week alone.
If you were to sell 310,000 copies today, first week, you would be considered a savior of the music industry.
Super Unknown will eventually go on to sell a total of 9 million copies worldwide. The music video for the single Black Hole Sun becomes a hit on MTV. And in 1995, Soundgarden wins 2 Grammy Awards.
Winning a Grammy can be more important than album sales. It takes you outside of your fan base and actually has the ability to make you famous in a way that you might not be before.
Fame inevitably brings fortune. As the chief songwriter, writing more than half of the hits on the album, Chris Cornell will take home an even bigger slice of the pie.
In every band, the member that makes the most money is the member that writes the songs. And in Soundgarden, that was pretty much Chris Cornell. And that is always a source of tension.
The next few years would be a blur of relentless touring and TV appearances around the world. But fame and fortune would start to cause cracks.
Chris and the band are having internal struggles, and if you know anything about bands fighting, it's never pretty. Ever.
By 1997, tensions within Soundgarden are at an all-time high.
They are at each other's throats.
In April 1997, at the height of their fame, Soundgarden officially breaks up.
It's not just a personal decision among band members, but it's a business decision. They say it's not about money, but it's always about money.
This marks a monumental turning point for Chris Cornell. He will radically split from all he's known before, but not before sliding deeper into depression and substance abuse.
There were always demons that haunt him. Sometimes he could channel them creatively into great songs and great performances, but other times I think he was just haunted.
When grunge superstar Chris Cornell dies in 2017, the official cause of death shocks the world.
Chris Cornell's death was determined to be a suicide.
Everybody was surprised by this. He was happy. He was settled. His life had really taken on a completely different vein. He was no longer the wild child ripping his shirt off in concert.
His grieving widow Vicky and his children make headlines when they accuse his longtime doctor of overprescribing Chris anti-anxiety drugs.
The family of Chris Cornell is not the first celebrity family to blame suicide on a doctor. This is very similar to Prince's family and very similar to Michael Jackson's family.
20 years before, Chris Cornell is going through an extremely dark period after the breakup of his band Soundgarden. But instead of seeking professional help, he's self-medicating to cope.
Chris walks away from the band, his marriage is disintegrating, and he's hitting that bottle a lot.
Like he'd done his entire career so far, Chris pours his angst into his music. His first solo album, Euphoria Morning, comes out in 1999, but it's far from a commercial success, selling only 393,000 copies. Around the same time, his wife Susan Silver makes a major life change.
Susan decides to step back in the band management so she can focus on her family and Chris, and they eventually have a daughter together. Her name was Lily.
With his solo career failing to launch, Chris is at a critical crossroads. But in 2001, an opportunity comes along that nobody could have expected. When another popular band called Rage Against the Machine begins looking for a new lead singer.
According to Tom Morello, the guitar player of Rage Against the Machine, the minute Chris came in and sang the first song that they had for him, the deal was cemented. It was obvious. It was like he had been in that band his whole life.
They name themselves Audioslave and write an impressive 21 songs during 19 days of rehearsal.
Audioslave recorded their first record, but before they could even release it, things started to go south.
Chris leaves the band without any explanation. The rumor is that it's a conflict between the band members' various managers. But the truth is, Chris had descended into a full-blown depression and addiction that sends him into rehab.
First comes Audioslave, then comes rehab, then comes the divorce from Susan, which essentially comes out of nowhere.
After 14 years together, Chris calls it quits on his relationship and separates from Susan Silver.
They were under the pressures of celebrity. They were under the pressure of mental health issues. They were under the pressure of Chris's drug use, and it was breaking. And it broke.
By 2003, fresh out of rehab, Chris and Audioslave head out on a world tour to support their self-titled debut album. In just 1 week of its release, the album sells 162,000 copies, and a month later, the album goes gold.
Chris Cornell comes out of rehab after fighting through addiction and ends up in one of the most charming cities in the world, Paris. And in Paris, he falls in love.
The object of Chris's affection is Vicky Karianis, an American publicist working in Paris.
Publicists are a different breed of people. They really have to toughen up and have a thick sort of skin. So it's no surprise that Vicky was a tough cookie.
I interviewed him. She was in control. She took care of all the aspects of the interview. And I remember one time she came in, she was carrying a little dog that had been dyed pink. But you had to go through Vicky to get to Chris. She was very protective of him.
In October 2003, Chris Cornell officially files for divorce from Susan Silver. And by January 2004, he surprises her by setting a hard date to mediate their divorce.
Chris Cornell gives Susan Silver an ultimatum. She needs to agree to the mediation date or else.
He puts an offer on the table under the condition that his deadline be met. In exchange for Susan releasing her interest in his professional goodwill, Chris offers her their homes in West Seattle and Ojai, California, with everything inside, in exchange for their cabin and condo in Seattle, along with the contents. The rest of their joint property would be split evenly.
His demand would give them 5 weeks to evaluate Chris's professional goodwill.
So when a celebrity gets divorced, it's pretty easy to sort out the tangible assets that you can touch and feel, cars and bank accounts and so forth. Accountants can sort those and divide up those tangible assets. It's when you get into the intangible assets, and in a particular divorce of a celebrity, those intangible assets, the value of their name, the value of their persona has to be valued.
On March 1st, 2004, Chris Cornell and Susan Silver sign a property agreement and a parenting agreement regarding their daughter Lily. 2 months later, Chris moves to Paris and marries Vicky, who is now pregnant with their daughter Tony, born in September of that year. A new marriage, a new baby, and a new band. Clean and sober, Chris Cornell moves forward in the next chapter of his life with renewed energy.
I've done a lot of things in my career, but when it comes to what my problems were with drug and alcohol abuse, wasn't any different than anybody else's. And you have to do the exact same things to learn how to get through it and start living a different kind of life.
In 2005, Chris and Audioslave make history as an American band, breaking barriers through their live performance in Cuba.
They went down to Cuba and played, becoming the first band ever to do that.
They had to front $1 million in order to do so. The concert was free, and they performed to an audience of over 70,000.
In light of the strained relationship the U.S. has with Cuba, this is a monumental cultural event.
Every band is looking to make a claim to history. For Audioslave, it was an opportunity to play a gig in Cuba, which had been a communist country that the United States had been kind of in a Cold War with almost since its beginning, since 1960 and when Castro took power.
The DVD of the Havana visit and concert is released in 2005 and certified platinum in less than 2 months. And with his music career riding high, by 2006, he is offered a once-in-a-lifetime offer to record the theme song to the latest James Bond incarnation, starring Daniel Craig.
Getting a hit song on a James Bond movie is a big deal.
It was a little bit frightening. The criteria was, think outside the box, do whatever you want. We don't want it to sound like any other Bond theme ever.
He does a song called You Know My Name, and it becomes a terrific hit, selling more than 3 million copies.
And in a very savvy move, Chris Cornell strikes a deal to ensure the song would not be on the film's soundtrack album, but on his next solo album instead.
That way, he was able to use the money that they would use to promote that single as basically promotion for his own record.
With his solo career on track, Chris Cornell decides to leave Audioslave. The entire time Chris has been with the band, he's been in an increasingly bitter legal battle with his former wife, Susan Silver.
At some point, Chris Cornell failed to honor their parenting plan, and Susan Silver took him to court.
Chris came back and said, hey, you mismanaged my career. You were more favorable to some of the members of Soundgarden, and therefore you owe me a significant amount of money for that mismanagement.
And on top of the money, he wanted back his personal effects, his Grammys, his demo tapes, his guitars.
According to court papers, Chris has 15 guitars in one of the homes that Susan got in the divorce. He wants them back, but Susan isn't budging. According to their property settlement, they're hers by right.
Susan has custody of all of Chris's guitars, which, as a rock star, is the worst possible screw you that could happen to you.
In 2006, Susan agrees to give back his demos and awards, but not the guitars, which included, among others, a 26 Gretsch rock jet known as the Black Hole Sun guitar, a 1953 Telecaster, a Cherry Sunburst Les Paul, and an American Fender White jazz bass.
She could have just been trying to seek vengeance against him because she knew he really wanted these guitars. He's a major celebrity, and these guitars were very, very valuable. So maybe it was just a financial decision she made to hang on to these.
According to a legal declaration made by Chris, at the time of their property settlement talks in 2003, he thought the guitars were in his storage unit. He had no idea Susan had them in her possession.
And Susan became public enemy #1.
The lawsuits drag on, and their public disputes get increasingly ugly. Finally, after 3 years of fighting, in December 2008, Susan Silver and Chris Cornell reach a settlement, and Chris gets his guitars back.
When he finally got them back, he went on a very public forum, his own website that had thousands and thousands of dedicated fans, and he blasted his ex-wife.
Chris is not only reunited with his prized guitars. A few years later, in 2010, he would come full circle and reunite with the members of Soundgarden.
From the moment Soundgarden broke up, there were offers for them to get back together. They turned that down year after year after year after year. But you get towards the end of the first decade of the 2000s, it's like, yeah, this is stupid money. Why are we turning it down again?
At the same time, Chris's solo acoustic tours are selling out and his songs are earning rave reviews. To outsiders, Chris Cornell seems happy and healthy. Nobody is prepared for the old wounds that his death will reopen. In 1997, Chris Cornell, the charismatic grunge rocker known for his amazing voice, walks away from his superstar band at the height of their popularity. In 2010, fans are thrilled to hear Soundgarden is getting back together.
There is so much money to be made reuniting at big bands. because you can fill stadiums. You can fill amphitheaters. You can fill arenas, which you really haven't been able to do with a lot of bands that have come along in the 2000s.
Soundgarden tours North America to ecstatic audiences, and in 2011, they released their first studio album in 15 years. Chris Cornell's voice is in top form. King Animal sells 83,000 copies in the US in its first week of release, to land its position at number 5 on the Billboard 200 chart.
Soundgarden comes back together, and they're as important a rock force as they had ever been.
The next few years are a whirlwind for Chris creatively, and by 2017, he is back on tour with Soundgarden and prepping songs for their next album.
As far as anybody knew, that last tour was going great. The audiences were great, the band sounded great, everybody was getting along just fine.
On May 17, 2017, Soundgarden plays the Fox Theater in Detroit to almost 5,000 fans. Just before the show, he calls his wife, Vicky.
They were already making plans for the future for their next vacation over Memorial Day weekend.
After the show, Chris goes back to his hotel room while the rest of the band board their buses for their next show in Ohio.
Chris talks to his wife, Vicky, and is apparently distressed about something. He's anxious. So he tells her that he's going to take a couple of Ativan and go to sleep.
She said he was slurring his words, he didn't seem himself, he was acting differently.
When Chris hangs up abruptly, Vicky tries frantically to call him back, but she gets no answer.
She knows something is wrong. There's an instinct that we have when someone close to us is in trouble. And I think she knew it, which is why she called his bodyguard. The bodyguard gets to the room, the door's locked. He kicks in the door. There's no one in the room. He goes to the bathroom door. That door's locked. He kicks in the door.
Chris is on the floor with blood running from his mouth and a red exercise band around his neck. EMTs work frantically on an unresponsive Chris Cornell.
I cannot imagine, and I can't imagine that anyone can, know what Vicky was going through in those moments and what she had to tell her children.
Chris is declared dead at the scene. The coroner will rule the death as a suicide.
I don't think any of us knew that at 52 years old, he was still fighting the same demons. And unfortunately, in Chris's case, his problems weren't the kind of problems that you grow out of.
The autopsy report reveals the presence of multiple drugs in Chris's system. While the post-mortem report states the drugs were not a cause of death, Vicky is adamant that her husband would never kill himself intentionally. She blames the anti-anxiety medication he was on.
One of the side effects of anti-anxiety medication is actually, which is odd, suicidal thoughts.
In November 2018, Vicky and Chris's children file a medical malpractice suit against his doctor for overprescribing mind-altering controlled substances that clouded Chris's judgment.
When one sues a doctor for what's called medical malpractice, what we're looking at is not intentional behavior. This is not a criminal act. So the question we ask ourselves is, did this doctor depart from the reasonable standard of care? Would a reasonable doctor continuously prescribe what has been alleged to be over 940 doses of an anti-anxiety medication over a 2-year period from 2015 to 2017?
A year after Chris Cornell's death, Vicky and his 3 children are in Seattle to unveil a life-size statue that cost nearly $200,000 to create.
And the artist said that Vicky gave him her favorite picture of Chris doing the rock god pose.
Not long after, Chris's ex-wife, Susan Silver, sues Vicky Cornell.
Susan came back into the picture claiming that their daughter, Lily, was not adequately financially taken care of for the future.
Silver accuses Vicky of failing to honor a $5,000 per month child support agreement to cover Lily's expenses, including health insurance and tuition fees.
Vicky was adamant in the dispute that everything owed to Lily was paid.
Silver is also seeking an account of Chris Cornell's estate to determine hers and Lily's share.
Seems really interesting that Susan Silver would get a property settlement under her divorce, and yet years later, when her ex-husband passes away, asks for more and almost wants to renegotiate the property settlement.
The lawsuit comes shortly after Lily had apparently dropped out of college.
There are allegations that Lily never told Vicky that she had dropped out of school, that she was taking the money and in some ways representing herself as still a student so that she could get the money. You have this father, who's a millionaire, who's no longer with us. What's a couple of more dollars to pay for education? I'm entitled to it, let me take it. And that might have been what Lily was thinking.
Vicky doesn't ask for the tuition back, but her lawyers state publicly that if Lily has any educational expense requests, they'll need proof of her enrollment. It's then that Lily takes to Instagram to give her side of the story.
Taking into consideration that Lily just lost her dad, and knowing all of the mental health issues that Chris also endured, it's really nice to know that Lily was able to recognize it within herself that she really needed to take this time off.
The case between Susan Silver and Vicky Cornell seems to be under wraps in court.
At the end of the day, Lily is Chris Cornell's daughter, and it appears that in recent times, the family has gotten along as a whole, and she has a relationship with Vicky and Vicky's children as well. So it shows you that in the end, in spite of what strife there may be, families can come together.
But just as it would appear that the war between the women in Chris Cornell's life is laid to rest, an even bigger and nastier battle is brewing between Vicky Cornell and the remaining members of Soundgarden. The sudden and surprising death of grunge icon Chris Cornell in 2017 at the age of 52 from an apparent suicide stunned the world. Early reports estimate his estate is worth $60 million, while his widow Vicky claims in court it's closer to $20 million. Soon after his death, Vicky sues his doctor for malpractice. His ex-wife and former manager Susan Silver sues Vicky for unpaid child support and royalties, and now his former bandmates are about to sue Vicky for unreleased music.
Soundgarden was in a very precarious position after Chris's untimely death. They lost their figurehead. They were at risk on what their future was.
Hanging in the balance are 7 unreleased music tracks.
And no doubt, the release, even in a drip campaign of 7 new songs, Chris Cornell singing lead, has exponential value.
Even more crucial is who has the right to speak for Chris Cornell.
Who was going to control Chris Cornell's ultimate legacy? Was it going to be his wife that he had been married to since 2004, or was it going to be his band members?
Upon his death, all of Chris's possessions end up with Vicky Cornell. That includes a computer, a laptop. And on that laptop are some files, vocal demos that he was doing for the next Soundgarden record. Soundgarden claims that, wait a second, those demos are for us. We own them. Vicky wants a say in how those demos are used with Soundgarden. Soundgarden saying, no, we're the band. You have nothing to do with the band.
Vicky accuses the band members of refusing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties that are owed to her and Chris's kids.
Vicky was alleging that Soundgarden was trying to strong-arm her into turning over the unreleased audio recordings because they were withholding Chris's royalties from her and her children, which she was entitled to under the law. Meanwhile, Soundgarden was saying they had just decided not to disperse any royalties, and when they did, she would get what was hers.
In the lawsuit, Vicky also accuses lead guitarist Kim Thale of riling cyberstalkers who were targeting her family with death threats when he suggests via social media that she's blocking the release of the album.
Fans can be very scared, as we've seen throughout the history of pop music, most recently with the Britney Spears fan, the Taylor Swift fan who will attack you. Soundgarden had passionate, dedicated fans, and when they thought that Vicky might be holding back an album from release, they absolutely exploded online.
Some fans go as far as perpetuating vicious rumors that Vicky plotted Chris's death to get his fortune.
Can we really believe that this grieving spouse would have in some way orchestrated his death for money?
Vicky's worries about her family's safety are not unfounded. In 2014, the FBI arrested a fan named Jessica Robbins for stalking Chris Cornell after allegedly harassing him online.
Chris and Vicky were so terrified of this online fan that they pulled both of their kids out from their New York public schools. After Jessica Robbins misses her court date, she removes her ankle monitor and then shows up to one of Chris's concerts in 2016. She was arrested again.
In February 2020, Soundgarden fires back at Vicki Cornell's lawsuit with a motion to dismiss, and they don't stop there.
They actually countersued her, and they countersued her for fraudulent inducement, saying that they had been convinced to play at a charity concert for Chris Cornell after he passed away to raise money for his foundation. But they claimed that Vicki, instead of giving the money all away to charity, instead was diverting some of it to herself and her family.
Vicki fights back.
In fact, her attorney went on the attack, claiming that they did not play for free for this concert. Instead, they were paid $78,000 to play. In addition, they were adamant that every single penny went on to charity.
Soundgarden drops that claim, but comes back with another attack, accusing Vicki Cornell of hijacking the band's social media account.
Social media accounts are going to become more and more of an issue when a celebrity passes away. Who has the right to control these accounts? Now, if it's an individual, it appears that it would go to whoever they leave their intellectual property to. But when it's a band or you're a member of an organization, it really is a big question mark.
If that celebrity is going to continue to be marketable and relevant to future generations, social media is a very important component to that. Perhaps the most important component.
The fight between Vicki Cornell and Soundgarden is one that must be decided before the courts in order to determine the fate of the 7 unreleased music tracks.
Do they become a Soundgarden record, or do they become a Chris Cornell record, or do they just disappear?
Even though Chris Cornell is no longer here to weigh in on the fate of his music, the power of his voice continues.
Chris Cornell, he's going to be remembered for his talent. There's never going to be another one like it.
Chris Cornell's death affected music fans tremendously. I still get emails from people saying, I can't believe he's gone. His music meant so much to me. So fans, I think, are all in for a Soundgarden record, if they can get it.
I think for Chris Cornell, his real legacy are his children first. His children have turned out to be wonderful, talented people. Likewise, his music, which were like his children as well. But I think that it's not really about money. It's really about the body of work that he left behind more than anything.